CherryandStonePublishing.com presents an excerpt from Danthology 2022. Written by Dan Kirstein. Read by me, Dan Kirstein. The Short-Lived Sin. Connor pretended he couldn't hear his brother sobbing as he lit the match and threw it into the metal trash can. The blood-stained sheets were lit ablaze with a soft huff that was muffled by the sound of the spraying hose. Mud ran along his shoes, trailing from the shovels that were now soaking wet. There were no neighbors for some distance, so they worked in daylight, which was just as well. Connor couldn't wait another day. It was his idea, so the terrible deed was left to him. All Mike had to do was help dig the hole and bury her. He wasn't sure why, but Connor found comfort in watching the sheets burn. It was a small moment, but it was all his. The last thing he could control before they lived the rest of their lives on the run. Connor knew full well he was out of his depth. He didn't know if water could really rinse fingerprints off a shovel. He didn't know how long it would take for someone to realize his mother was missing. And he didn't know what they would do next, so he stood by the fire and contemplated. The hose fell into the mud as Connor heard footsteps behind him. He felt Mike's hand on his back. When he turned, he saw his brother's chubby face, now red and puffy. Mike's darkened eyes wouldn't meet that of his brother's, and he spoke in a weak and broken voice. "He's still there." Finally turning from the metal trash can, Connor looked towards the mound and found its self-appointed sentry. Ritchie was an Irish wolfhound with long, storm-cloud gray fur that tapered off into a frayed black. Weighing over 125 pounds, when he stood on his hind legs, the dog was as tall as Connor. Ritchie's black, solemn eyes stared down his long snout, which was as wide as a human's wrist. He was called away from his bed that morning. The door to the bedroom was closed, and when it was reopened, his mother was lying in the bloodied white sheets, which were dragged to this very spot. While they were burying her, Ritchie could smell her blood on Connor's jeans. He knew he'd failed to protect her, so there he sat. Connor sneered at the dog. He stormed off to the wooden fence, unhitched the latch, and dragged the gate open. "Ritchie!" Connor faked enthusiasm over his disdain. "Come on, boy!" He called the dog, but Ritchie learned from this morning. This time, he wouldn't come. The older brother grit his teeth before walking back to the mound and grabbing the dog's tagless collar. He tugged once before hearing an earnest and low growl. Fine. The collar was released before the two boys walked back to the house, opening the sliding glass screen door. Mike immediately entered the house, and Connor expected to have to stop the dog from following. But the dog never moved, so Connor slid the door shut. The messy kitchen was quiet and different, as every room in the house would be from now on. Connor's voice barely filled it. "Pack your things." Mike nodded, still refusing to meet eyes with his brother. "Where are we going?" Connor didn't know. "We can't stay here. We're leaving in the morning." "What about Ritchie?" "He was Mom's. Now he's no one's." As he heard his brother hum an acknowledgement and ascend the steps, Connor stared at Ritchie. The dog hadn't moved. Of course, Mike couldn't sleep that night. He sat up in his bed with the most pronounced frown of his life, his eyes finally out of tears. So he walked by the packed bags that sat against his wall and made his way downstairs. While he filled up a glass of water from the kitchen sink, he looked outside to see that Ritchie had finally moved from the head of the mound and was now waiting at the door. Mike noticed that the dog's tail didn't wag, nor did he show any sign of gladness to see him, but he wanted to be let inside. Mike couldn't help but feel bad for the dog. He'd lost his mom too, so the boy opened the door and took the dog's bowl to fill it. But when the bowl full of food was placed on the floor, Ritchie was nowhere to be found. Mike looked around before shrugging. He took his glass of water from the counter and went back to bed. Connor was not like his brother. This was proving to be the best night's sleep of his life. The burden that weighed on his soul was now dead and buried in their backyard. He slept on his back, his arms outstretched on either side, peaceful and quiet. He'd been so exhausted from digging that he'd slept in his clothes. The door had been taken off its hinges long ago, allowing the naked bulb from the hallway to provide some light into the room. Ritchie's muddy and gray paws stalked slowly across the carpet of Connor's bedroom. He placed his forelegs on the side of the bed, one at a time, quietly and slowly, so as not to wake the boy he knew to be a deep sleeper. He positioned himself over Connor's face, looking down at him. The older brother stirred, feeling a hot breath upon his face. He grunted and blinked, trying to make sense of the shape that loomed over him. The hallway light peeked through the wolfhound's scraggly fur, and in the same instant that Connor attempted to leap from his bed, the dog's teeth had found his neck. This has been an excerpt from Danthology 2022. Copyright 2022. For more by Dan Kirstein, visit Cherry and Stone Publishing.